So I've as Ellie said, this is sort of a result of writing a chapter or an essay as a contribution to the book on TED, and I wrote it during lockdown, and I've called it Sensible Buildings, which is not quite what it sounds like, but another version of sensible, and so. And of course, now I'm not going to
click on the screen.
Just click on the screen.
Click on the screen.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I first heard Ted speak in the late 1980s when I was a student in Liverpool, and he came to talk about Fountains Abbey when it was still on the drawing board, and it was the most extraordinary lecture. He turned up with some felt tip pens, a roll of acetate, and in those days, he used an overhead projector to tell a story. He made one very long drawing, and he talked about the landscape. He talked about Fountains Abbey and Studley Royal Water Gardens. He talked about buildings and ruins and paths and vistas. And in a way, it's kind of reminded me of Alfred Wainwright and this kind of surveying the land and understanding the land, befriending the place. And he did this, at least to my recollection, with no slides and simply a series of drawings. And what he talked about topography, he talked about perspective, and he talked about, well, I guess the culmination of it was that we all agreed that the building was the right building in the right place. That because the commission invited the positioning of the building and a re-understanding of the place. And as this drawing shows, and this drawing comes from Architecture Today, an article when the building was finally completed. And it kind of, the building cast a new perspective on the place. If you can see my arrow, the building is here and forms a courtyard and a kind of aperture through which the landscape is seen for the first time, but seen from a new perspective. And the courtyard form, I think, I understand it as having something to do with kind of rural buildings, making a farm building. What's interesting is the way in which it kept the landscape at bay. And I'm not going to talk in great detail about the building, because really this is just about my first experience of hearing an architect, an eloquent architect, talk about his work, but to do it through drawings. And as I mentioned, the idea that the architecture in a way could make things appear, or rather how the landscape, things appeared and disappeared. And this is the tower of Fountains Abbey seen through the proposed courtyard of the building. And here it is seen kind of foreshortened from the courtyard as built. And what I guess this was an architect who didn't seek to overcomplicate, to obfuscate, but to use his architecture to explain a place, to explain a landscape, and to make sense of that landscape. So I first read about Ted's work, about the office's work, studio's work, in February 1985. And I just want to put it in some context, because it's interesting with 35 years distance, that in December of 1984, the Starts Gallery was published in the Architectural Review. And the Architectural Review, I was still at school at this point, the Architectural Review was kind of my window on the world of architecture. I had a copy of Ken Frampton's Modern Architecture Critical History, but I'd only sort of dipped into it. So first of all, Stirling, and then in January, there was the work of, there was a whole issue on the Netherlands on Halle van Eyck, Herman Hertzberger, and Theo Bosch. And then in February, there was an issue on working with the past. And amongst the buildings, there was this project for Calthorpe School in Fleet in Hampshire, one of actually a pair of projects by practice. And this building has stayed with me for a very long time. It's or project, and it's the renovation of a 1960s building, and actually the addition of a building in the sort of language of the renovated building. And it's extraordinary to think that in the 1980s, this building was only 20 years old and was in pretty poor condition. And the project in terms of renovation was in a sense to turn something which is abstract and ill-suited, totally unrelated to its place, system built, into something which revealed a great deal about the climate. So through this kind of introduction of a lightweight steel frame, these overhanging eaves and these sun breakers, this third space between the inside and the outside was created, a liminal space, something which was quite literally making the building attractive. I don't mean, I mean attractive in a sensory way, not just a visual way, but in terms of warmth and cool, shade and sun, dry and damp. And the building, I mean, it's very pragmatic in as much as that it was going to protect the original building from solar gain, and it was going to protect this lightweight structure, ill-suited to the weather, from deterioration. And I mean, normally renovation is kind of, well, I guess renovation is finally recognized, or refurbishment and the reuse of buildings is finally becoming recognized as you know, an incredibly important part of the practice of building. But at the time, and for much of the time I've practiced, it's always been a last resort. And also it's been a kind of way of working which often lacks clarity. What struck me about this project was how clear it was, how unbelievably clear it was. And it reveals the personality of the architect, as it were, to see art in the practical and to relate the building to the natural world. To visit this building is to understand that we have a climate, that there is weather. So I'm going to go back to his early work, 3 houses which were all designed and built between 1959 and 1963. This building no longer exists. It's the Horder House in Hampshire. And then there's Marvin House in California and Ted's own house in Camden. And I guess this is really about developing a language. Again, so here's his drawing of the landscape. The building is built on a bank, surrounded by trees, facing south, looking down towards a stream. And he describes in these drawings how a series of posts are cast or driven into the ground, and from that beams and a platform and a north wall to protect the house from the elements to the north of the site. And then a sequence of events where as it were, sort of cellular rooms are made at each end. Large doors are created, or door frames created here, and a beam. And finally, a screen of patent glazing is overlaid across the building. It's a simple diagram. What it suggests is, in a way, that the building is instrumental. It's about this threshold between interior and exterior. And the oversailing, I mean, I guess the sustainable argument for a building like this might have changed a little bit, but this idea of this inclined glazed screen extending beyond the doors, of course, emphasizes its singular importance in relation to the building. At the same time, or similar time, he made the Marvin House in California, again, built by hand. And again, there's this idea of a linear building. There's a blockwork structure of cells, and then there's a platform, a timber frame structure. And what this drawing shows, I suppose, if you squint, is that series of cells is a wall in itself, removed from the world. Ted described them as a series of green rooms, and by implication, the platform, the living space, the place in which to live, sleep, eat, lies outside the wall. It lies in the landscape. And this drawing is so clear in the way that it creates an aesthetic, a reading of this relationship between natural landscape, represented by the contours, and the diaphragm wall, the green rooms, and the stage, let's say, the platform. So once again, and there's this hierarchy of materiality, it's very clear. And once again, this kind of idea that the house can be distilled in a way to align, this notion of a threshold between inside and outside. And that in this case, the room to be lived in is in the landscape. It is looking at the landscape, but it's also in the landscape. When he designed his house, he did something really powerful, which was to turn the building away from the street. And in reorientating it away from the street, basically, as I read it, it sort of avoids convention of front and back, and any decorum that you might associate with the formalities. And it abstracts it from its urban setting. And we have a great, I'm not going to talk so much about the buildings, but the way I guess it's the reading of the buildings as opposed to the detail of the buildings. But you have a ground floor of bedrooms and an upper floor of open living space. The plan bisects the site. So the north half, or northeast half, is on the left, and he's building, and on the right hand southwest side is a garden partly over the garage. In doing this, the building is abstracted from its urban context and seems then to have to do with the phenomena, whether it's in a city or not. And although although it is finite in as much as the plot is delimited by boundaries, somehow it seems to look beyond the limitations of its urban context. This may be a strange comparison, but this is Ando's, I think it's the Nakayama house. And I'm going to make the comparison, I suppose, in the way that this is 20 years later. But here's an architect, on the face of it, doing something quite similar. Turning a building away from the street, orientating it to the side, bisecting the site, half inside, half outside. But what Ando does is he isolates the building from its context. He creates a kind of vacuum there is atmosphere, but it's so radically different from the openness with which Ted's house embraces, as it were, the multiple phenomena of the natural world. And there's a series of drawings here that describe the building of it. And I suppose there's living and there's living and designing in a natural context, in the weather, in the climate. Then there's building in it. And this building was built and designed to be built over a number of years. And so building becomes a verb as much as a noun. And the building has to take care of itself as it's built. And this series of drawings shows the sequence by which the house is constructed, first by placing a wall on the north boundary, and then constructing a frame, and then building a roof, all of which is designed to establish the shelter that's needed through a hierarchy of materials, then to allow the building gradually to be built. So unlike Ando, who in a sense conflates the designed building with the built building, Cullinan's house exploits the material, both the detail, but the hierarchy of materiality. So the building becomes an expression of the sequence of building, and in a way that kind of not completeness, with the possibility of it existing in a variety of different states during the process. I'm just going to read a paragraph from from the contribution to the book, which is a sort of summation, I suppose, of the way I see these three houses. The brickwork and the blockwork, the concrete frames and platforms, and the joinery used to make these houses are all elementary materials, derived essentially from the earth. So too are the spatial compositions and configurations, each of which depend on the simplest possible drawn gesture, the making of a line. In reality, this translates into a constructed threshold or liminal space between inside and outside, mediating between and so enriching the otherwise absolute interior and exterior. These three houses share a basic anatomy. They share a linear plan and orientate their internal space towards a primary aspect. It's as if to build is to draw a line between inside and outside. So the architecture draws our attention to nature. These houses stare at nature. They reimagine architecture to be a binary rather than a decimal system. And it is the simplicity of the system that allows Cullinan at first to work out what mattered, how this could be reflected in his work and shared with his collaborators. In time, the topological configurations would become more complex, and the liminality expressed in other ways in response to different circumstances and more demanding spatial programs. During the 70s, I'm not going to talk about every building, and I'm not even going to talk about them necessarily in chronological order. But next, I'm going to talk about briefly a couple of housing projects in London built in the 70s, designed and built in the 70s. This one, Layton Crescent. The building is I suppose it has a formality and an informality. What's interesting is the way that it addresses the kind of I guess ideas about social structures, patterns of life, how you make a facade, how you deal with the practical things of rain and sun, and that relationship between inside and outside. And these felt tip pen diagrams show the quadripartite plan of the building. And it's this, one of the things which I think is intriguing, there's no great need for decorum in the Horder House or the Marvin House, but of course, by the time you get the Camden Mews, that reorientating of the building fundamentally breaks, as I said earlier, with that question of decorum. That the building is free to be lived in, freed of many of the kind of conventions and associations we might have with fronts and backs. And although this building has a front and a back, it treats those things as experiences to be lived between the inside and the outside, to the extent to which the plan on the inside is liberated by a series of movable partitions or screens. And it's the facade and that space immediately outside the facade which in a way qualifies that free plan on the inside. And this playful photograph, I suppose, actually does speak volumes about, whilst there's that formality, the colourfulness of all the people in this photograph, which I'm guessing is probably the office and friends at the time. And that sense that the inhabitation of this building, the living in this building, the dwelling in this building is so closely, it is that relationship between inside and outside manifest by the balcony and the terrace. And something which I think this I don't know, but I'm guessing, and is quite extraordinary if it is the case. So you have this lightweight structure on the outside that forms the support for the balconies. And then you'll notice there's two very fine columns of blue that run into the balustrade. And I think that's where the rainwater is collected, either side of the entrance. In a very different situation, Highgrove housing. Again, this question of kind of how we should live. It's not so much about how these buildings look, and they look different, made of, the various projects are made of different materials. This is the site plan, and you'll notice the difference between these. So again, like Layton, where Layton Crescent was an apartment building, this is a series of houses. And again, a quadripartite plan. So these clusters of sort of semi-detached but back-to-back houses. The thing about fronts and backs is thoroughly, we're not confused, but convention sort of somehow managing to avoid convention. And much of these houses are separated by narrow paths, and further down here, they're separated by driveways. And I think the next plan, or this drawing, shows a kind of Christmas tree section of these two houses, of course, 4 houses, back to back. And the section gradually steps in and becomes quite narrow at the top. The plan dispenses with fronts and backs again, and creates, garage and the entrance within the gable, which enables the house to totally turn itself towards the garden, not front or back, but just to the world. And then you'll notice here's a triangle here, and you can see the shape of the roof. And at the moment, I suppose, where you might be slightly exposed to people passing between the houses, the roof drops right down the cat slide and captures the water in this water butt. And so, of course, again, you're invited as a family to live in this room inside, and for life just very naturally to flow between inside and outside. And it seemed it's so unusual to make a house, or rather to make mass housing, let's call it, with this degree of freedom to live, let's say. 8 years after Ted designed or completed his house, he was commissioned, or rather the studio, Cullinan's practice, was commissioned to design 4 branch buildings for the Olivetti typewriter and computer company. And they were in Belfast, Carlisle, Derby and Dundee, and at least one of them still exists. And at the time they were designed with I think before the oil crisis, and there was an expectation that the buildings would grow. And so you can essentially, they take let's say the linear typology of the houses and wrap them around a future garden, or begin to wrap them around a garden, with the ambition that when complete, they'll fully enclose a garden, which seems to have something to do with where they were, because they were often in industrial estates and housing estates. And there's this opportunity to isolate, or rather to conjure up a world around which people might work, slightly removed from the situation in which it's to be built. And the plan is, perhaps the plan in the section here, building is built, there's a concrete platform that forms the floor of the main offices, and it's a mixture of offices and workshops and so on, and there's some parking and stores beneath. And between the two, there's a more informal reception and kind of coffee space. And this drawing shows the process, I guess, by which, or rather the sketches by which the building is made, forming the platform and building and forming the frame over the platform and completing the section. And it's a section which, of course, recurs in many later projects. And it's a section which is so the generator of it is the light and the sunlight and the capturing of water and the draining of water. And these, so here we are in the office floor, 5 meter high space, where, as the previous section, you've got 2 monopitches meeting and a clear story between. And it's very unusual because it's almost a building without walls, in fact, because on the outside, it's then as if the roof and the walls have been rotated. So the outside wall is actually the combination of 2 inclined planes meeting at an apex, and they meet at the point of the gutter. And then cut into that are a series of triangular windows and inclined windows. So you've got the meeting of 2 glazed planes. So it's a sort of simple, rudimentary construction. Mark Girouard describes the primary floor as flexible, sociable, and easy to understand. You can see aspects, well, the section of the Kowecki house and the Garrett house in the section of the building. Hugh Pearman wrote a piece in the RBA Journal relatively recently, certainly within the last decade, where he makes a comparison between Stirling's Florey building, but one also sees something of the sort of Terrassen Hauser section of the sort of early mid 20th century housing, and of course recall in some respects Lasdun's building student housing at UEA. But one also can see perhaps right in this, as in the Marion County Centre, there's something quite extraordinary about, almost arc-like about this building. But again, you can see the way in which the architecture is making manifest something which so many other architects would choose to design out and disguise, and instead here the building celebrates the way that this great roof, because of the triangular windows, which you can see here, the water is shed around the windows, captured in the gutter. The gutter then extends beyond this corner. Again, the surface is also exposed here, and all of it captured through these and descends in these hugely expressed chains and to the floor. And the again, this happened early on with the Marvin House, where between the cellular diaphragm wall and the platform, the room, the single living room, there is this huge trough that captures the water between the two. It's surprisingly modern. It's surprisingly bright and colourful, I suppose. That's what really was shocking when having seen the building in black and white, as it were. I think I said earlier, one thinks of it almost like an ark set up on a hill. This way in which building seems to have to do with practical things and has to do with the weather and has to do with the landscape comes to a kind of culmination in the RMC headquarters building, which was completed in I think the very early 90s, 1990. It's a building that, in a sense, turns figure to ground and ground to figure, as it were. It's an architecture of gardens rather than building. But the question is, where does it come from? And I mean, you can see how it it threads through the work. This is the Lambeth Community Care Centre, and I suppose by comparison to the RMC building, the situation and the brief is simpler, but the idea is clear, that the organisation of the building is to place the daycare facilities in a slightly sunken masonry platform or plinth, and then to put the bedrooms, raise the bedrooms up, and to enable them to relate to the garden. And so it is, in a way, it's through the making of this roof that kind of liberates the wall to be to mediate between inside and out, and to achieve that experience you might not otherwise get, of that total freedom. So both section in terms of the hierarchy of what happens on the ground and what happens above, and then the role of the roof as veranda, that then totally transforms and enriches the experience of perhaps lying in a bed and having a strong visual connection with the garden. And this idea of the garden being at the heart of a building keeps recurring. And this is the Whittington Daycare Centre. And this is a little, relatively, single-story building apart from a tower over here. But it's planned around a garden. Everything relates to that garden, carved out of that plan. So the RMC building, ready-mix concrete building, comes in that sequence of projects. And this is, I think, from the AJ, as then when it was published in 1990. Talked about a vanishing act. And it's I watched Ted on Cullinan's website. There was, on the studio's website, there was a film of an event organised by the 20th Century Society where Ted drew and talked about the building, and then Max Fordham and others a discussion and lots of things discussed. And it's the significance of this building. I mean, I was by this point in my year out in London, and I remember poring over the drawings and studying it. And the project, it's set in a probably a much fought after, as it were, sort of a conservative area. And so what happened was there was these three houses, two Georgian houses, one here and one here, and an arts and crafts house here. And unfortunately, I don't have a drawing of or photograph of it as found, with all the ad hoc elements around these buildings. And there were certain constraints set on the building, but the building, the plan organizes itself around a garden that runs to the east of this house, and a garden that runs to the east of this house, and then a third garden in between. And gradually the plan of the building extends just to touch the arts and crafts house, and to complete the relationship, as it were, between these three coincidentally related buildings. And as that photograph suggests, it's almost not building. And it sets up a series of axialities this way, but also a series of axialities this way, of movement inside and outside the building. The office becomes a garden. So this is the, on that plan, the left-hand garden and the right-hand garden, and the one in between. The building is, the offices were naturally ventilated, naturally lit, and that was possible because of the thermal mass of the concrete that was supporting the roof gardens. But it was, what was achieved was not just the natural ventilation of offices, but the natural ventilation of offices, dining rooms, laboratories, a lecture theatre, and a swimming pool. All of which was made possible whilst at the same time glazing almost continuously all of the outside walls. So to do with the thermal mass of the roof and the planting above it, and the shading that was given around the edges, but also the light that could be brought in around the edges and over the top. And it's I suppose there's sort of two tectonics going on here. There is the underlying concrete structure, the one that gives it the mass and the solidity. And then there is this finer grain of steel work, which is used not only to negotiate the changes in level in terms of staircases, but is used to achieve the detail, to resolve the edge. I suppose the detail is not quite the right word. So we have a relatively deep plan, not a deep plan, lit in the middle, lit at the edges, a weight of soil above, which allows for the planting of many things. But of course, that then presents a heavy edge here. And one of the questions that this threw up was how to resolve that kind of crude 1 meter edge of the building. And it's done, and also to deal with guarding and so on. And so you get this whole other architecture that is created by the lightweight steelwork, which is used to support a trough that then supports the hedges that then form the guarding to the roof. So you can see this build up, you see this build up, all of which is, so this concrete becomes a kind of benign force, as it were, that underpins the building. But this much lighter, finer, playful architecture is the one that we read, that we experience. In that sort of seminar, I think it was Richard Gooden who had worked in the office, made an observation that the plan had something. There were similarities with Lutyens' Lambay Castle, where Lutyens encircles a series of buildings and makes what might otherwise have been unintentional intentional. So strong, so clear, the intentionality, the kind of this latency in terms of the relationship between these buildings, and this reversal, this figure becomes ground. I think it's this is a seminal piece of work, because I think at this time, this sense of how we build buildings is we're preoccupied by the engineering of buildings to make them sustainable, as opposed to the experience of buildings that will make our lives sustainable. And this idea that, as it were, that the environment is understood as a series of phenomena, not as a sort of technological problem. It can be, and inevitably is, a technological problem. But for us to love and to be concerned with it, it's something which we have to understand. We have to take an interest in. We have to appreciate the fact that the sun shines and the rain falls, and that this is what makes buildings, I suppose. And again, I think pretty much to conclude, I want to read the end of the piece that I wrote, which hopefully kind of sums up in the context of this. COVID has revealed certain things, but the discussion about embodied energy, the various discussions that are going on about sustainability, I still don't think are getting at the root of what this work, that Cullinan Studios' work, reveals to me about building. A recent study led by the medical school at the University of Exeter highlighted the correlation between people who have been reconnecting with nature and behaving sustainably. It's not surprising. Consciousness breeds conscience. For more than half a century, Ted's buildings have been reconnecting their inhabitants with nature. It's been possible because his buildings associate their inhabitants with their situation and express the manner in which they respond to phenomena. He spoke of a tradition that concerns itself he spoke of a tradition that concerns itself with particular conditions and particular situations. A tradition that composes with asymmetry and balance, is open in form and is expressive, and through expressiveness is decorative. A tradition that uses industrial production in the service of particularity. He admired Team 10 because there was a group of European architects who'd responded to their environment and situation, to physical and human geography, and to the anthropological potential that the inhabitants and their activities might generate, rather than the reductionist functionalism of pre-war Europe or post-war commercial modernism. In the 1980s, it was quite apparent, even as a student, that Cullinan had more in common with Aldo van Eyck and his Dutch colleagues, and little to do with postmodernism or the British high tech. Cullinan's studio was not interested in built rhetoric, obfuscation, or abstraction. His was quite the opposite kind of architecture, too generalized enclosing skins of Miesian boxes. He chose to find art in the practical requirements of building. It stemmed from a knowledge and respect for the arts and crafts, for Green and Green, Wright, Schindler, Lutyens, Rietveld, much of Corbusier's work, Lubetkin, and the other tradition of modern architecture, Sharoon, Alto, et al. Cullinan was concerned with shelter because it was born out of self-sufficiency and common sense, and an interest in being outdoors in the countryside, walking in the mountains, standing in the sun. These are not to Cullinan abstract ideas. They're things he enjoyed, his pastimes, things he wanted to do, experiences he cherished and wished to share with others. It seemed early on that Ted didn't always want to build walls. This reflected a curiosity about all forms of construction, something that few architects have. Lacking this curiosity, most architects never find the confidence to build, just to draw. Now, due to hugely complex regulations, a plethora of manufactured products and systems, and the complex interfaces that these create, the perceptible or recognizable aspects of construction are often very hard to comprehend and to harness. Building is increasingly hard to grasp. So Cullinan's record of mediating between the tempered interior and the elements, and the way he chose to configure and construct his architecture to make buildings that we can quite literally understand, leaves a vitally important legacy. Thanks.
Simon, thank you. That was beautiful. Could you share your screen and then we can see you full bleed. If people have questions, please pitch them or just let me know now rather than at 7:59, so that I can kind of come to you and I'll unmute. You showed lots of material I didn't know, Simon, and what was Bacon is one of the things that I think was very striking about the way you presented, particularly Ted's house and the housing schemes that you showed was just there is an ambivalence about the city that's kind of always present, I think, in the work that you were showing, and this relationship with nature that's always very present at the kind of center of the work. I wonder how readily reconcilable you think that is with an architecture that can contribute to sort of urban qualities.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's interesting how much the discussion at the moment it obsesses with a kind of urbanism, with a historicist solidity and urbanity, and the extent to which we lose out on the intuitive, because it's not just about sort of the natural world, but it is so vitally important to find a way of building. If we have to build in cities, it's so vitally important to find a way of building in the city, which in a sense doesn't flip automatically. It's as if in certain architects' hands, they build a certain way in the countryside, perhaps, and they build a completely different way in the city. As if, these two are completely different things. And yet we build in the weather, and we build for each other, and we build to live. And it's that, again, the tracing of the sort of anthropological aspects of Ted's work and the studio's work from Team 10 and perhaps the alternative tradition that Colin Singleton Wilson wrote about. It's quite literally a different way of life. And I think it is a real challenge for us to try and reconcile the formalities that perhaps many of us are drawn to with these other much more kind of humane aspects of architecture.
And I think you kind of were stressing that the image of inhabitation is absolutely bound up with the image of these buildings, and in a way that I think is true of Lasdun's work, perhaps, you know, obviously for whom Ted was working kind of previously. But yeah, the buildings are, in a sense, stages for human occupation.
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess, I mean, in your own work, I'm looking at a wall of balconies behind you, Simon. But has that become a kind of a motivating factor? Do you think, is that something you connect with in this work?
Well, certainly the social life of our buildings and the life at the threshold between inside and outside is the most pressing thing, I think. In some respects, because within the limitations of current practice, so much stuff is codified or constrained, and it is that threshold in a way that qualifies everything else that's possible. But one of the things that, you know, I started by just, you know, I wanted to place my experience of Ted's work in a context, which, you know, particularly that sequence of opening the third AR I'd ever had, and I saw the school, and I saw something that was abstract and, quite frankly, useless after 20 years become animated and wholly appropriate, and revealing sort of the magic of what happens in the weather, as it were, you know. And then, you know, the RMC building, but also placing it in the context of that project by Stirling, placing it in the context of Van Eyck, Hertzberger, because there's all sorts of strands going on, isn't there? There's the social life of these buildings, and there's the technical aspects of building them and the why they're being built. We build, you know, building for, it's the how we live becomes the why we build, I suppose.
And I think in a lot of this, for me, the strongest projects, there is this DIY ethic that's quite central to the conception of the schemes. Even, you know, I think in the Downland Gridshell, it's sort of kind of a, you know, present, this idea of an architecture that's made by hand and is scaled to be made by hand, which, yeah, I think it feels there's a sort of a political impulse there. I also have a memory of a lecture from the early 90s, a little later, that I saw Ted give again with the overhead projector, where he was talking about the his experience of building social housing in the 70s, and how ultimately he'd sort of come to the conclusion it might have been better just to give the money directly to the people who he was kind of you know, attempting to house, and that sort of almost anarchist kind of Colin Ward sort of impulse feels to be kind of bubbling beneath, I think, quite a lot of the work that you were showing today.
Yeah.
Guys, if we've got questions, please, it'd be lovely to hear from someone who worked or works in the practice. All I'm seeing is Irene Scalbert is saying, I have to go, but I wish to say that I have found the presentation to be one of the most sensitive and receptive lectures I've had the pleasure to hear for a while. Thank you, Simon. We do have a question, and it's from Ros Diamond, who I will unmute. Ros.
Hi, Simon, thanks very much for that, because you've presented some projects which I haven't thought about for a very long time, but seeing the image of the Marvin House at the beginning and the quote in the AR, the title of the review of the later project, suddenly made me think of a very different connection indeed. And although I very much appreciate some of the comments that Ellis was making about the kind of things which relate to Colin Weald, the inventiveness of construction. There's something experimental which suddenly, looking at that house and then thinking, curiously, made me think of visiting Jørn Utzon's house project for himself, Can Lease. And it made me think of two things. One, of course, is a modernism which is about topography and the picturesque, which relates to Lasdun, of course. It's something that Jonathan Hill talks about in his book, but also something else, which is a different kind, both of an attitude to the communal in architecture and something to do with experimental work in construction. And I thought maybe you'd like to comment on that.
On the correlation of those two things? Or?
Whether you think that there is anything in that, yes.
The correlation between a method of construction and the sort of social life of the building. Am I understanding you right? I was sort of listening to you thinking it wasn't a question.
Well, in a way it isn't.
For me, well, it's interesting. Yeah. Maybe for me, it's not a question. It's a statement. Yes, I think, I find perhaps it's something to do with abstraction. Because if you can't, there is a kind of humanity both in the way we build and the way if the spaces relate to the patterns of life, that seems to correlate with the way that the technology of construction becomes tangible. It's forms of tangibility, isn't it? It's as opposed to degrees of abstraction. And so much architecture, in a way, seeks to obfuscate, to abstract, to disguise, to conceal, as it were. And yet there's this in this work, there's a kind of humility, and there's a directness, and there's a sociability, and it's clear. One of the things that I think I perhaps was more articulate, perhaps in the end, in the things that I've written, perhaps than said. But there's this thing in a way that the architecture sheds light on the place in which it's made, sheds light on the way that it's built, sheds light on the people who are going to live in the building. It's revealing so much. I mean, I feel a huge burden of talking about the work, but it came at a critical point in my education, and and one way or another, it remains an important dimension of aspects of practice.
Thank you.
Ellis,
yeah, we have a question from Roddy Langmuir, who I'm going to unmute.
Oh, hi. Simon, thanks for a lovely talk. And I think you cut through a lot of the sort of wallpaper commentary to get to the core of what the buildings are about. And I think that was done with simplicity and sensitivity. So I think it was a lovely talk. It struck a chord with me when you were talking about the school, because it was the reason I joined the practice back. I think I must have been educated at the same time as you, and I just loved the way at a time when a lot of building had such skinny skins, that here was a skinny building that was stretched out to almost a metre, and all the jobs of the facade were divided up and given different physical presence in the pieces that composed it, and that too giving a language of mathematics and of light and everything back to school. And I remember I was studying at Edinburgh, and somebody from the practice came up. It wasn't Ted actually, to open a little exhibition of the work of the practice, and there was a picture looking from the inside the building out. I don't think I'd ever seen a picture looking through the window of a building to the outside from inside. And it just showed the effect of all those layers, what they would do in terms of how the light would be received by the building. It was all done with a sort of collage drawing technique. Robin actually maybe remember the moment, because he was already there in the practice. But I think that stretching of that cladding zone was a recognition of the need for the liminal space that you described, you know, being such an important part of buildings. And I think it's ever more important now, because we're in the same position now where we've all been cooped up, and these spaces, you know, the bay windows and the porches and the edges of our houses and our workplaces are just ever more important as that sort of median between the social external world and the interior. So I think it's very applicable today. Anyway, it's not really a question.
No, but I completely agree, and it's because it's about the inhabitation of the building that becomes so rich, so much more rich for that possibility, but also the building becomes perceptible. You know, modern building is essentially a series of layers of lamina, and they're technical, they work, they do certain things, but they're incomprehensible. What's interesting about that building is, and it was kind of triggered by the fact that it was a renovation, meant that it did expand, but you know, it could easily have just been layers of stuff stuck on the building, and that would have been the end of it. But it educates, wasn't it? But not in a worthy way, but it actually, like I said, it reminds us that it rains, you know, and that actually when it rains now, I can go outside that building and stay dry, or I can open the window really wide and stay dry. And if it's really hot, I take cover. And these are things which are really wonderful.